second slide, yes. This is, I'm showing you this because some of you might remember that the author of this book gave a really great talk here about Mr. Buchanan and his bosom friend, William Rufus King, who's on your right. And their relationship explains this next slide of a Cuban sugar house. Now, in the first half of 1853, both personal and policy reasons drew James Buchanan's attention to Cuba. His bosom friend, King, who had recently been elected vice president, was dying from a lung disease and was seeking a popular treatment in a Cuban sugar house. On the recommendation of doctors, King was undertaking this sugar cure, a popular therapy at the time for well-to-do Americans. In King's case, this therapy would be unsuccessful. So in the sugar house, King sat his chair for 2 hours every day, inhaling the sweet, thick vapors, which were supposed to improve your lungs. And he's breathing deeply while enslaved Africans and indentured Chinese, who aren't shown here, did perilous life and limb-threatening work. The sugar house workers dumped bundles of sugarcane into presses that squeezed the sap from the cane stalks. Other enslaved or indentured workers then stirred the vats to reduce the sap, and it was boiled down. Now, King would have been sitting here probably oblivious to the life-threatening labor that the enslaved people around him were performing, much as these ladies are sitting here having tea. And this painting is from about the same time that he would have done this. Because King enslaved about 180 people on his Alabama cotton plantation, he probably remained oblivious to the hazards of the sugar house. In the American economy, investors, slaveholders, slave traders, and as I'm going to explain in the rest of the talk, coolie traders, had considerable interest in the continued prosperity of the Cuban economy with its main export of sugar. Their interests would probably suffer if the coerced importation of its African and Chinese labor force ceased. Also, increasing numbers of American and European consumers sweetened their food and beverages with Cuban sugar, about 1/2 of the island's output. Now, while sugar brought pleasure to their taste buds, they remained unaware that sugar processing doomed tens of thousands of enslaved Africans and indentured Chinese workers to unfreedom and death. So now we're going to look at a slide showing the production of Cuban sugar. And as you'll see, from 1830 to 1860, it increases 4 times. And sugar is moving. In the 18th century, we would find sugar as a luxury. By 1860, it's become a middle-class commodity. Just one statistic I found fun, that during the Revolution, each American might have consumed 4 pounds of sugar a year. By 1850, this number had risen to 20 pounds. And for your information, we're supposed to be eating 120 pounds a year, but the number's trending down. All right, now, I want you to look at this table and especially damp. Okay, you've got, it just went to sleep. what I wanted you to do is look at the number 1859, okay? And what you will see, I think I'm on an angle, so am I? Okay, so you will see that that's the apogee, of slaves being imported, I would add illegally, into Cuba. And then look over here for the number that you didn't expect, which is the coolies imported during the same year, 13,000. So sugar production means more demand for labor, which means more importation of Africans and Chinese into Cuba. So I'm going to now tell you during the next few slides some information about the coolie trade. Now, you associate the Chinese with gold and California and the Transcontinental Railroad, but not with Buchanan. And Americans called all Chinese immigrants coolies, and they didn't differentiate them from the laborers in Peru and Cuba, but they're quite different. The Chinese on the West Coast, the American West Coast, left their country voluntarily for labor in this country, while those laboring in Peru and Cuba were mostly recruited by force or deception. And that's what made it so wrong. No matter what their destination, most of the immigrants from China left from its southern provinces. And that's why I put this up here. I wanted you to be able to orient yourself. And you might ask, why did this number of people leave? In fact, Chinese had been immigrating from their country for a long time. They go to Siam, they go to South America, and they go to the United States, millions of them. The coolies were needed for labor in Cuba as well as in Peru. And we're going to learn about the guano islands. Guano, as you know, is bird excrement. So guano was a potent fertilizer. The Incan people had known this for centuries, but Europeans only figured this out in the late 1840s. Both California gold and Peruvian white gold produced huge profits. But in Peru, those profits did not go to the men who actually mined the white gold. In both Peru and Cuba, the Chinese laborers suffered brutal working conditions. American enslavers often pointed out that coolie labor was far crueler than slave labor because the Cuban plantation owner had no interest in the preservation of the life of his worker as long as he existed for 8 years. An opponent of slavery once noted, too, that human misery could sink no lower. So what we're going to find is that Democrats and Whigs and Republicans were in partisan agreement, rare then as well as now, and they agreed that the coolie trade was horrific. Now, while these Chinese indentured laborers expected that they would return to their homeland at the end of their indenture, the arduous, dangerous work and miserable living conditions they suffered meant that they had a low chance of surviving for as many as 10 years. Further, in Cuba, if they did survive, the government passed laws that transformed a term of indentured labor into a lifetime of unfree labor. When word of this deceit reached China, Chinese men refused to sign these contracts. Now, let's move to the Guano Islands. And The Chincha Islands are here off the coast of Peru. And that's why I have that map up. And then I drew these advertisements from trade cards of the time to show you the popularity of guano and its advertisement. Of course, no one shows the laborers at all. It's all about the beneficial effects. We do have the bird down there, though. All right, so on the Chincha Islands, you're going to find brutal heat, back-breaking labor, and noxious ammonia fumes from the guano that can burn your lungs, and that's going to kill you. Finally, for Chinese laborers headed to either destination, the voyage was 110 or 120 days, depending on where you were going. And that voyage was so punishing that American and British critics called it a second Middle Passage, referring, of course, to the African slave trade. To recruit Chinese labor for either destination, European and American traders had to resort to either force or falsehood. In China, they employed crimps or coolie brokers. These crimps kidnapped, deceived, and captured their countrymen, who were then incarcerated in a barracoon or coolie warehouse. And then note that that same word is used to warehouse Africans on the African coast for the slave trade. So like the slave trade, this coolie trade was based on involuntary migration and involuntary labor. Now, the journey to Cuba or Peru itself resulted in casualties of 10 to 20% of the people aboard, sometimes more than that. When the Chinese laborers contracted disease en route, they were thrown overboard, dead or alive. Other men committed suicide by hurling themselves into the sea. Some did so just to escape the 8 horrific years that faced them in Peru or Cuba. Others did so when their queues were cut off by the crew to discourage the spread of lice. Cutting off a queue was a cultural insult and violation of Chinese law. The Chinese people believed that if one died without shedding blood, that one's spirit returned to China, thus the suicides. So I'm going to show you some pictures here. Everything works. All right, so up here is a barracoon at Macau. And over here, of course, is a coolie being punished on a coolie ship. And he may have signed up involuntarily, and then he's captured, and then he suffers this whipping with the cat o' nine tails. Down here is the beautiful clipper ship, the Sea Witch, which started from the East Coast of the United States, and it was transporting coolies to Havana when it shipwrecked near Cuba, and about 300 of its Chinese passengers were killed. So in that case, you have a mortality rate of around 50%. And so when you see pictures of clipper ships now, they're just wonderful things. You know, you can imagine going with the wind on that. You also have to imagine the terrible cargo that they carried at times. Now, I want to talk about another accident, and this is happened off the Philippines, and the ship is called the Waverly. And the Chinese aboard became unruly. They wanted to disembark. And so the crew locked down the hatches to keep them under the decks. They unlocked them 13 hours later, and some 220 of the passengers had suffocated or died of heat prostration. Learning of this disaster, an American journalist, and he was also a merchant, wrote, "The Waverly tragedy makes me shudder and chills my very blood. I picture the blackened, swollen forms of 250 humans, the one piled on the other. It's worse even than the frozen soldiers of Napoleon in Russia, or the startling horrors of the Black Hole of Calcutta." Once on the Guano Islands, the workers lived in cane huts and received minimal rations. With pickaxes and wheelbarrows, the malnourished men had to dig and move 5 tons of guano every day to loading points on the island's cliffs. Then, wearing cloth masks, not our K95, made from rags to guard their noses and mouths from the poisonous guano dust, the workers shoveled the pulverized rock into chutes that fed the guano into the holds of anchored ships from the United States and Europe. If the debilitating heat, exhaustion, or thirst slowed their work, drivers or overseers armed with stout cattle whips lashed them. The drivers might administer over 30 lashes that left the mutilated, suffering men incapable of staggering to a medical hut. Should they recover, the Chinese men sometimes committed suicide by self-starvation or by jumping from the island cliffs into the Pacific surf. So although their bodies had perished in the sea, their spirits would live in China. Now, this horror, this human horror of the coolie trade attracted the attention, how could it not, of Buchanan's ministers or ambassadors to China. First, Pennsylvanian William Reed, who's here, and then John Ward were in China and worked to reform the coolie trade. Both men were political appointments, as ambassadorships are often used for to this day. Both men had supported Buchanan's presidential campaign. Reed had persuaded Whigs, had tried to persuade Whigs in Pennsylvania to desert their party and support Buchanan. And Ward had chaired the 1856 Democratic National Convention. The diplomats' motives for eliminating the brutal, dishonest treatment of the Chinese forced to emigrate were primarily humanitarian. But I have to admit, they also witnessed how the coercion of Chinese laborers aggregated anti-foreign sentiment in China, making it unsafe for Western sailors, merchants, and diplomats in Chinese ports. So if you wanted to increase American trade, you had to get rid of the coolie trade. Reed, a former history professor at the University of Pennsylvania and Attorney General of Pennsylvania, tried to stop American participation in the trade by invoking an 1818 anti-slave trade law. He warned American ship captains and masters that transporting indentured Chinese may expose them to penalties of the law. But he made this threat without sanction from Congress or the White House. To gain that sanction, Reed wrote Buchanan's Secretary of State to discover if the 1818 slave trade law might cover the coolie trade. Now let's look at that law. I hope you could read this. And you will see that it applies both to Negroes and persons of color. Additionally, it forbade not only the importation of these people into the United States, but also their transportation from Africa or from any other foreign kingdom, place, or country for the purpose either of enslavement or, importantly for us, being held to labor. So think of those key terms that I've tried to mark in green, but I couldn't draw a straight line. And you'll figure out that Reed wanted this law to apply to the coolie trade if one considered that the Chinese people were people of color, and if contracts of indenture implied that they were being held to labor, especially if they were being held to labor against their will. So, back in the White House and in the Buchanan administration, we've got Attorney General Jeremiah Black, and he responds to this in 1859, and he says, no, the law does not apply. So that's not good. So Reed, when he figures out about this, when he finally, 4 months later, gets the communication, he'll realize that he has had no legal authority for doing what he tried to do. But Reed didn't find out for 4 months. And so, you know, and then there's the 4 months that it took the letter to get to Washington. So in this interim, Reed is ordering American consuls in the ports that they had to inform Chinese officials of the pending departure of an American coolie ship. And they were to aid Chinese authorities if they wished to inspect the citizens, the Chinese citizens on the departing ship. The authorities then might deny that ship what's known as a grand chop or certificate of port clearance until an American consular official determined that the laborers were voluntarily aboard and that they wanted to emigrate. Assisted by a translator, the American consul would interview the indentured Chinese to determine this. Sometimes more than 50% either did not understand their contract, where they were going and for how long they had to work, or they admitted that they had signed the contract under duress. So Reed concludes, he says, I'm doing this because I hope that my reform will deter Americans from participating in a trade so revolting to humanity and discreditable to the parties involved. The next minister to China, the Georgian, John Ward, has first had as his assignment in China a diplomatic mission to Beijing. When he comes back, he witnesses anti-foreign riots in Shanghai, protesting the activities of Chinese crimps who were using nefarious methods to fill the coolie ships. In response, the Chinese Imperial Commissioner starts to round up and then behead the crimps. And he also instructs the foreign diplomats that they should take responsibility for their own countrymen and stop their recruiting of Chinese men for emigration. Now, if you remember that slide with all the numbers, the one where I said, look at 1859, you will remember that in that year, American ships dominated the coolie trade. And Ward is promising to use every power that he has to stop this. What's happened is that by then, the English have given orders to their ships that they're not allowed to carry Chinese against their will. So the English trading firms hire American ships. See, they're still making money. So in one instance that I've read about, Ward saved about 432 Chinese on board the American ship Messenger. And of course, the British had hired this ship. When Ward investigated whether the Chinese aboard the Messenger had signed their indentures voluntarily, all 432 of them testified that crimps had either kidnapped them or duped them to make them sign up. So, hearing this testimony, the Chinese authorities relieved the men from their indentures and they all went ashore. Now, Ward was able to save those 432, but he was unable to save future passengers. The ship left the Chinese port, sails to Macau, which is a port controlled by the Portuguese, loads up again, and heads to Havana. Now that you know a little bit about the infamous coolie trade, let's look at Buchanan's career and his long emphasis during his entire political life on Cuba. He always stressed the vast importance of the island of Cuba to the United States. And he, from the beginning, he's offering am I going backwards? Yes. And from the beginning, he is offering, now I'm really, where the heck? Sorry, I got mixed up. I practice this at home, obviously not enough. So what is concerning to him? He always sees the strategic geopolitical importance of Cuba because as Americans moved west and these states become productive agriculturally and ships begin moving out, the best way to get out of the Gulf of Mexico is through the Straits of Florida. So if you control those straits, you control the Gulf of Mexico and the shipping of the southern United States. Now, the first president to talk about this was Jefferson. And from Jefferson's time, even until the present day, between a third and a half of American commerce goes through New Orleans and these ports. It's terrifically important. And that is why Buchanan is making a big deal from the beginning of his political career, because he's a Democrat. And as a Democrat, he has to win Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats. And don't forget who his good buddies were, right? William King and other Southern Democrats. So he thoroughly understands this, and they're talking about it at dinner, right? Okay. So Buchanan argues that in the worst case, that the country in control of Cuba need possess only a small naval force, and it could hermetically seal the mouth of the Mississippi. Now, let's jump forward, and I need you to think about America in the 1850s. And this is the decade that is full of dreams of territorial expansion, or America's manifest destiny. And those dreams are especially prevalent among Democrats and the people of the southern United States. The 1850s were the years of extra governmental efforts or filibusters to add the Baja Peninsula, Nicaragua, and Cuba to the United States. All the filibusters failed. Buchanan, first as a diplomat and then as president tries legal means to bring Cuba into the United States. Now, President Peirce, who had appointed William King as his vice president, see, all this is coming together, he appoints ministers to the major European nations who are Democrats, obviously, and pro-slavery. We've got Buchanan and the minister to France and the minister to Spain. All of them want to annex Cuba. So Peirce asked them to meet and to discuss this prospect. So what happens is that they produced a proposal, which you know about, but I'm not going to use the name you know about it just yet. They produced a proposal that will cause Cuba to become part of the United States. They go back and they rehearse the usual commercial and geographic arguments for Cuban acquisition. But their document adds a new reason. The ministers explain the dangerous consequences resulting from the system of immigration and labor lately organized within the island's limits. Now, you should recognize that new system as Chinese indentured labor. This development, they thought, portended an insurrection at every moment, and it may result in direful consequences for the American people. Thus, the authors suggested that their country had a political interest in stopping the employment of indentured Chinese workers and the infamous trade that brought these workers from their homeland. Of course, the termination of the coolie trade implied that the ministers also believed that the enslavement of Africans should continue. Because where else was the labor going to come from for the sugar? When the communication to Peirce became public, opponents of expansion derided the document by calling it a manifesto. And that's where we get the name that we all learned in school, the Ostend Manifesto. And newspapers castigated the plan, and cartoons ridiculed it. And of course, Buchanan is a main figure. So here I have one. There's, you will recognize Mr. Buchanan, and those four street toughs are engaged in mugging him, and they use the actual words of the Ostend Manifesto, it says up here. They use the actual words to justify their taking his hat, his wallet, his coat, and his keys. So, what is going to happen? With this intense ridicule, of which this cartoon is only a sample, one would think that Buchanan might abandon this plan. After all, he wants to be elected president, but he didn't. And it remains a key item on his presidential agenda. So 2 years after all this ridicule, the public learns once again of Buchanan's continuing ambitions for Cuba after he's nominated for the presidency by the Democratic Party. So here at Wheatland, a representative of the party from Mississippi delivers the official notification to Buchanan. Quizzed by the Mississippi senator about his support for the interests of the slave South, our nominee first said that he adhered totally to the new Democratic Party platform. As president, he would take as his priority settling the slavery question upon such terms as would give peace and safety to the Union and security to the South. Buchanan concluded his policy statements with a wish that he expressed so strongly that his visitor recorded these words in italics. If I can be instrumental in settling the slavery question upon the terms I have mentioned, and then add Cuba to the Union, I shall, if president, be willing to give up the ghost. Not die. He would let his vice president take over. So when this ambition became widely known, another cartoon. In this one, you will see Buchanan has been altering his coat and has been putting on a Cuba patch. So the public at this time, unlike us, was very aware of Buchanan's ambitions for Cuba. Now, while president, Buchanan did fulfill his ambitions, at least on paper. In every single presidential address to Congress, except one, he mentions Cuban acquisition. In 1862, he adds to his arguments a humanitarian one. He predicts that if the United States acquires Cuba, the African slave trade will cease. And there will be many benefits to Africa and to England and to the United States, which had been spending a lot of money maintaining anti-slave trade patrols on the coasts of Africa and Cuba. Still, Buchanan omitted the most significant benefit for American enslavers. When he promised the abolition of the African slave trade, he did not mention the beneficial results for the existing domestic slave trade in the United States. And this slide is rather breathtaking because it shows the northern origins of enslaved people who are being sold south to the cotton and sugar, and increasingly westward to Galveston and Texas. In the 1850s, over 250,000 enslaved people moved across state lines. So you really have to think about the domestic slave trade. The acquisition of Cuba would therefore end the African slave trade, because guess where the slaves are going to come from, while increasing the territories available for the domestic slave trade. They would now include Cuba and its economy, as we have seen, because of the demand for sugar, needs ever more laborers to support the expansion of its plantation industries. Now, how is Buchanan going to do this as president? The first thing he does in 57 and 58, that's 18, he secretly dispatches a friend who's a Philadelphia banker to Europe. And this man, Christopher Fallon, his project was to encourage European bankers to collect the debt that Spain owed them, because then Spain would have to sell Cuba to get money to pay the debt. Got it? Unfortunately, Fallon writes Buchanan back and visits him in the White House and says, this won't work. This will cause more trouble than it's worth. So we have a plan B. He turns to his best friend and political ally, not surprisingly, another Southerner, John Slidell, and from Louisiana. And the next year, Senator Slidell introduces a bill supporting the acquisition of Cuba. Now, following the Mexican War, remember, the United States takes half of Mexico, gets California, right? Okay. This man, John Slidell, becomes the best buddy. And Buchanan visits Slidell and his wife Mathilde at their plantation in Louisiana. And then I found this delighted me. Buchanan socialized with them one summer at Saratoga Springs. And not to watch the horses, but to take the springs. And Buchanan writes, Mrs. Slidell is the most gay, brilliant, and fashionable lady at the Springs. And as I am her admirer, I am attached to her party. So I am thus rendered a little more conspicuous in the beau monde than I would desire. So what does Buchanan and Slidell then develop a plan, and it's based on a carrot strategy or a reward strategy. This bill granted the president $30 million, not to buy Cuba, but to negotiate with Spain for the purchase of Cuba. $30 million was the carrot. And the report of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations supporting this bill explicitly explained the reasons for this purchase. It showed the linkage between sugar production, the illegal slave trade, and the coolie trade. First, the report demonstrated the incredible statistics about the spread and popularity of sugar across the Atlantic world. Between 1841 and 1857, the consumption of sugar in the United States quadrupled, and in England, it doubled. Slidell's report bragged about the economic power the country would gain with the addition of Cuban sugar to the sugar production of his own state of Louisiana. We should, in a few years, have as complete a control of this great staple, which has long since ceased to be a luxury and become almost a necessity of life, as we now have of cotton. So what you have to remember and think about is the most important agricultural commodities in the mid-19th century, coffee, cotton, sugar, they're all raised by enslaved, unfree people in Brazil, Cuba, and the United States. So Southerners aren't daft when they think that slavery is declining. It's not. It's increasing. So what are we going to do about this? So racist thinking obviously is going to be integral to the report. And they argue, of course, that it's slave labor that indentured labor makes enslaved labor look benign. In the racist construction of this argument, African people ranked well below Chinese people in a racial hierarchy that whites headed. To Slidell and his supporters, the coolie trade and indentured labor was even more nefarious than the slave trade for Africans because of the supposed superior civilization from which the Chinese came. They were more civilized, more intellectual, and therefore they felt more acutely the shackles of the slave ship and the harsh discipline of the overseer. Unfortunately, when this bill is introduced into the Senate, the United States is suffering from the aftermath of a severe financial panic. So money is tight. Plus, the Democratic Party had split into two major factions due to the heated debate about the future of slavery in Kansas. Consequently, Slidell could not assemble a majority to support his bill, so he withdraws it. Needless to say, Republicans denounced the acquisition because they saw its sole purpose as being to increase the political power of slavery. The interests of slaveholders would be increased in Congress, specifically the Senate. We have to remember that if Cuba became a state, or even as some people suggested, 2 states, that slaveholders would gain votes in the Senate. So, Republicans also are foreseeing that Cuba will provide the slave breeding states of the Upper South with an enlarged market. Slaves are going to be in greater demand, they said, than ever before. The slave breeders on the border states are going to sell off their stock with a rapidity hitherto unparalleled. They will be impelled by the double motive of increased price. Thus, the wave which is sweeping the Black population towards the Gulf of Mexico is going to receive an impetus of wonderful power. By the spring of 1859, Buchanan had learned that his plan to annex Cuba could not be achieved, either by the Ostend Manifesto or by legislation. The next year, Democrats are going to lose power to direct American foreign policy. The 2 decades of public pressure to end the coolie trade and the Atlantic slave trade shift after November 6, 1860. It's now going to focus on the recently empowered congressional Republicans and the newly elected President Lincoln. So in the winter of 1862, Lincoln and congressional Republicans do enact legislation to end the forced migration of Chinese laborers in American ships. In the same year, the administration also negotiates a treaty with Great Britain that brings to an end 2 centuries of slave trading across the Atlantic. This story, how the new Republican Congress and administration ends American participation in the coolie trade and the Atlantic slave trade and established freedom on the high seas, are stories for future presentations. Maybe you'll come. In conclusion, on this slide, my last one, please consider these points. First, when you go home, I want you to have the realization that the world economy had a global dimension in the 1850s and even before. You probably have never thought of the United States as linked to Africa, linked to Cuba, and linked to Peru, and linked to China. Point 1. Then I want you to think about President Buchanan. Now, he saw himself as a humanitarian because he wanted to abolish the African slave trade while retaining and expanding slavery in the United States. Also, he wanted to end the involuntary transport of Chinese laborers in American ships by exporting American enslaved people to Cuba. Thank you very much.